The email arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, just as John Wick was finishing a cup of black coffee in his quiet Los Angeles apartment. Among the usual messages, scripts forwarded by his agent, charity invitations, and polite fan letters, one subject line jumped out. Exclusive invitation. A candid conversation on The Melissa Carter Show. John paused, reading it twice. Melissa Carter was no ordinary talk show host. She was known for sharp, strategic questioning and for stirring up controversies that often went viral. The pitch promised a friendly sit-down to discuss John's career and his views on Hollywood's future. But John had spent enough time navigating Hollywood's pitfalls to sense that this might be more than just a harmless chat. Still, he exhaled a quiet breath and typed his response. "I'd be honored." Across town, in a glossy TV studio, Melissa Carter's producers huddled around a whiteboard scribbled with bullet points and strategic prompts. A top producer, Jake, tapped a marker against his chin. "We have to corner him," he said, glancing at Melissa. "He's the ultimate embodiment of the old Hollywood action hero, a stoic figure who stands for loyalty and justice. That's exactly what we want to break down." Melissa leaned back in her swivel chair, flipping through a stack of interview cards. "He's beloved," she said drily. "The audience sees him as a near-mythical figure. Polite, considerate, almost a real-life knight. But times are changing. We'll lure him into a debate about how outdated his roles are. If he defends them, we can paint him as clinging to the past." Jake nodded with a knowing smirk. "And if he falters or loses his cool, that's an even bigger story. Either way, we get our viral moment." Melissa didn't smile. She was focused, determined. "We want that clip shared millions of times. The audience will be carefully selected, some ardent fans, some ready to challenge him. The questions are loaded. All we need is for him to step into the snare." On the day of the interview, John Wick arrived on his sleek black motorcycle, hair pulled into a simple tie at the nape of his neck. A few crew members recognized him in the parking lot. They whispered, simultaneously excited and wary, as he passed. The star's mystique was legendary, rumored to be a man of few words, yet fiercely loyal to those who deserved it. Some staffers even felt a pang of guilt about the ambush plan, but producers reminded them, ratings were king. John was ushered to a backstage room where a young intern offered him water and signaled it would be a short wait. Through the door's narrow window, John glimpsed a portion of the set, bright lights, a large LED screen displaying the Melissa Carter Show, and an audience murmuring with anticipation. He recognized the subtle stage design typical of a talk show that specialized in controversy. Every detail carefully curated to present a certain narrative. This will be interesting, John thought, adjusting his cufflinks. He'd been in enough precarious situations to spot the signs of a setup, but an odd sense of calm washed over him. If Melissa Carter wanted a confrontation, he was prepared to meet it with the same unwavering composure that had defined him as an actor, and, more importantly, as a person. A stagehand guided him to the set. Applause swelled as John stepped into the spotlight, shaking Melissa's hand. Her smile was a dazzling showbiz grin, but her eyes gleamed with sharper intent. The cameras panned across the audience, capturing a mix of awe, curiosity, and something akin to skepticism. "John Wick," Melissa purred, "welcome to our show. It's an honor to have you." John settled into the plush chair opposite her, returning a polite smile. "Thanks for inviting me." As the applause died down, a hush seemed to blanket the room. Melissa's expression radiated warmth, but John could sense the tension coiling beneath. He braced for the first question. "So, John," she began lightly, "your career has been nothing short of extraordinary. You've portrayed iconic action heroes, people who solve problems through physicality, vengeance, even violence. Now, Hollywood's shifting. Some say it's time we move away from these tough, stoic figures. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is there still a place for that kind of leading man in the future?" Her words were buttered with a gentle tone, but John recognized the pointed subtext. She was framing his entire filmography, characters known for raw justice and unwavering resolve, as relics of an outdated era. The audience tilted forward, waiting for his response. He folded his hands, gaze steady. "I believe cinema reflects what audiences crave, stories about courage, loyalty, or redemption. If we strip away those themes because they're old-fashioned, we lose something important." Melissa feigned a sympathetic nod. Fair enough. But let's look deeper. Don't you think your roles, let's take your most famous vigilante, for example, reinforce a version of masculinity that's violent? Is it healthy to keep celebrating men who fix every problem with fists or guns? A few claps rose from a pocket of the audience. John's gaze flicked around, noting how those watchers seemed strategically placed. So this is how we're doing it, he mused. He offered a calm half-smile. Stories about standing against evil or defending loved ones can involve conflict. Sometimes that conflict is physical, but the core is about protecting what matters, not just random violence. Melissa raised her eyebrows. But that's your perspective as someone who's benefited from that image. Others argue that brand of hero is toxic, overshadowing more nuanced expressions of male identity. Don't you worry you're perpetuating stereotypes that hold us back? She let the question hang in the air. The producers, watching from behind monitors, exchanged pleased glances. This was the confrontation they'd orchestrated. If John Wick got defensive or stumbled, they'd have the perfect headline. Star doubles down on outdated violence. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression on John's face. Instead, he laughed softly. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a gentle, almost surprised sound. I think it's interesting to label virtue, like sacrifice or standing up for people who can't defend themselves, as toxic. If a story shows someone protecting the innocent or fighting back against injustice, how is that outdated? Melissa's smile tightened. She was losing that edge, so she pressed harder. Because it glamorizes aggression, she countered. Aren't we trying to evolve beyond the notion that men must always be violent to solve problems? John leaned forward slightly. In many of my films, violence is a last resort. The characters do everything possible to avoid it until they're cornered. Are we saying that if you're forced into a fight by evil, that's automatically toxic? Or is it about the reason behind the conflict? A ripple of agreement coursed through part of the audience, while others stayed silent. Melissa realized she had to escalate. She flipped through her cue cards, skipping to the ones scrawled with bolder, more inflammatory cues. All right, she said, voice turning sharper. But let's talk about your personal image. People celebrate you as this humble, gracious man, and yet you portray unstoppable killing machines on screen. Isn't that contradictory? Are you not aware that some fans literally idolize the violence in your films and want to imitate it? John inhaled quietly. He saw what she was doing, trying to force him to condemn his own audience or lash out. I'd hope, he said carefully, that people understand fiction is not a blueprint for real life. Movies are myths, cautionary tales, allegories. If someone tries to mimic the violent acts without grasping the moral cost, that's an issue of their interpretation, not the story's existence. Melissa's eyes narrowed. But you must take some responsibility, no? John paused, choosing his words. I think we all share responsibility. Actors, creators, and especially viewers. But responsibility doesn't mean censorship. I'd rather we teach context. Why violence happens, what it does to the soul, how it's not a game. My characters usually carry trauma from the fights they endure. The host's smirk returned. Trauma or not, these are male power fantasies. Guns blazing, unstoppable fists. This might have been normal in the past, but it doesn't reflect the inclusive, modern direction Hollywood claims to be going. At that moment, a certain hush fell over the crowd. They sensed a turning point. The backstage producers watched with gleaming eyes. Would John Wick snap? Would he argue, or reveal some hidden prejudice? They were poised to cut the perfect highlight for social media if he tripped. Yet John Wick merely smiled, a picture of composure. Respect and honor, he said quietly. Those used to be pretty normal values too, right? Are they outdated as well? A handful of watchers clapped spontaneously. Melissa reddened. Her carefully planned script was unraveling. She pressed on. Some might say that honor talk is a smokescreen for maintaining old power structures. John's face showed no anger, just a mild curiosity. Or maybe it's about not betraying those who trust you, or standing by what you believe in, even if it costs you. He tilted his head. If that's an old power structure, I'm not sure it needs tearing down. A few in the audience murmured agreement. The vibe was shifting. Sensing she was on the defensive, Melissa pushed for a knockout blow. You're revered by millions, John. But the question is, do you deserve it? Isn't it time for new voices, new types of heroes, and for you to step aside so you don't hog the spotlight with your old-fashioned, hyperviolent brand. Now the tension was electric. The entire room fell silent. John regarded Melissa quietly, the corners of his mouth lifting. So here's the real punch. She was basically telling him he was obsolete. The producers signaled each other. This was the moment they'd clip if he flared up in anger. But John Wick offered a measured response. So calm it sent a chill through the onlookers. I'm happy to see new heroes, he said. I'd welcome them. Stories evolve, always. But we shouldn't mistake evolution for erasing everything that came before. He paused, gaze sweeping the studio. Then, with a gentleness that contrasted the tension, he added, I was taught to respect those who paved the way. It's curious that respect has become optional. A hush fell. Melissa parted her lips, but no words emerged. She recognized that John had turned her own narrative upside down. Her plan to brand him as an outdated relic just made her appear disrespectful. And the audience, some nodding, some wide-eyed, realized the shift too. The producers' jaws tightened behind the scenes. The unstoppable meltdown they'd scripted for John Wick was happening to them instead. The show cut to a commercial break. The camera lights dimmed, but the damage was done, and the real storm was only beginning. When the lights flickered back on, the live broadcast resumed. Melissa Carter's face appeared on screens across the nation, her expression carefully schooled into a friendly smile, though an undercurrent of tension still rippled through the studio. Welcome back, she said, voice taut. I'm here with John Wick, discussing Hollywood's changing landscape. John Wick sat in the same posture, hands loosely folded, unaffected by the brewing storm. In the brief break, producers had frantically whispered in Melissa's ear to pivot topics and salvage the show's narrative. She cleared her throat, scanning her cue cards for a fresh angle. John, she began more softly, you've gained a reputation for compassion and humility in real life. Don't you see any contradiction between that and the roles you play, where you basically represent unstoppable aggression? John nodded thoughtfully, unruffled by her attempt to corner him. I think real life and fiction serve different purposes. If people watch my films just to see violence, they're missing the deeper messages. It's about loyalty, the cost of revenge, and how far someone will go for love or justice. Off-screen, I'm just a guy who tries to treat people with decency. Melissa forced a laugh. Treating people with decency sounds wonderful, but doesn't that clash with the image of you blowing away enemies on film? Perhaps it's time those kinds of movies fade out. John exhaled slowly. He'd seen the shift in her approach, from direct confrontation to subtle insinuations. Movies reflect human stories, love, betrayal, sacrifice. Sometimes those stories involve conflict that gets physical. If we want to pretend conflict never happens, or that we can't learn from it, that's ignoring reality. Instead, we can show consequences, regret, and the emotional toll. A few members of the audience nodded in agreement. Others scrolled through their phones, curious if the show was trending. Meanwhile, in the control booth, the producers scowled at each other. This was not the meltdown they'd hoped for. Instead of an outraged star, they were stuck with a quiet, thoughtful man who made the host's ambush look petty. Melissa realized she needed a bigger jolt to recapture the audience's attention. She pivoted abruptly. John, let's talk about your personal beliefs. You've spoken in past interviews about values like honor and respect, but in progressive circles, that talk can sound like code for upholding old patriarchal norms. Care to respond? A hush fell once more. The direct label of patriarchal felt loaded. The producers tensed, hoping this would spark the anger. But John Wick merely leaned forward. If believing in kindness, loyalty, and standing up for what's right makes me patriarchal, then I might question how we're defining that word. Because I think women, men, anyone can hold those values. The audience stirred, some clapping. Melissa's gaze flickered around. This was her final big card, painting him as a relic who refused to adapt. She pressed on. But the future we want is more inclusive. Doesn't your brand of stoic, masculine hero overshadow new voices, especially those from different backgrounds? John's expression remained neutral. I'm all for new voices. The more diverse stories, the richer our culture becomes. But we don't elevate new voices by silencing old ones. We can add without subtracting. It's not a zero-sum game. A wave of murmured agreement rolled through the crowd. Melissa swallowed, realizing she was losing them. She forced a final gambit. So, You're telling us you see no issue with the violence in your filmography or the outdated machismo your characters represent? John studied her calmly. I see issues with glorifying violence for the sake of it. But in my roles, the violence usually underscores how destructive revenge can be or how heartbreak fuels desperate choices. My characters pay a price for every bullet they fire. If people watch carefully, they see the toll it takes. Melissa opened her mouth, but John continued, voice quiet yet resonant. You keep saying outdated. But I've encountered fans, women, men, young, old, who see these stories as parables about grief, redemption, or sacrifice. Are those things outdated? I doubt it. And I think the future of Hollywood can include them alongside new, inclusive narratives. The hush that followed was tangible. A portion of the audience broke into applause, clearly moved by John's measured stance. Meanwhile, Melissa's face reddened. This was supposed to be her triumph, an orchestrated moment to break a star's image. Instead, she was the one looking cornered. Cut to commercial, a producer mouthed from offstage. But they'd already done that once. The show needed a concluding note. Melissa inhaled sharply, deciding on a last shot. All right, John, she said, forcing brightness into her voice. Time to wrap up. But a final question. Don't you think the world has enough stoic tough guys? Why not step aside and let Hollywood move on? Perhaps you should retire and make room for younger, more progressive actors. A stunned silence. Even the camera operators glanced at each other, taken aback by the bluntness. John Wick didn't flinch. He gave a mild shrug. Hollywood's big enough for everyone. My presence doesn't erase new talent. If you're suggesting I vanish because times have changed, I'd ask, is that truly progress? To discard those who came before. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Melissa tried to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. John's voice softened. I was raised to believe in respect for our predecessors. Seems that's gone out of style. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But I don't think respect needs an expiration date. It was a knockout punch disguised as a gentle observation. The audience erupted in applause, some uncertain, some enthusiastic. Melissa, lips pressed tight, could only plaster a half-smile on her face. The producers signaled the end. That's all for today, folks, Melissa managed. Stay tuned for more tomorrow. The instant the cameras faded to black, the atmosphere changed. People scrambled about, while Melissa avoided John's eyes. In the control room, a wave of panic spread as they replayed the interview footage. Their plan to trap John had backfired spectacularly. Not only had he refused to be riled, but he'd calmly turned each accusation on its head, making them look petty. By that same evening, short clips began surfacing on social media. One snippet in particular blazed across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. John Wick leaning forward, saying softly, I was taught to respect those who came before us. It's curious that respect has become optional. Reactions exploded. Hashtags like #RespectNeverOutdated and #JohnWickDidn'tFlinch soared in popularity. Users wrote, he just destroyed her arguments with a single line. Or this is how you handle a loaded interview, classy and calm. Others wrote, she tried to ambush him, but he turned the tables. The next morning, a short paparazzi clip of John Wick outside a small cafe sealed the deal. A tabloid reporter approached, microphone thrust forward. John, any thoughts on the Melissa Carter interview? John, holding a takeaway coffee, offered a subtle smile. Gentleness never goes out of style, he said, then walked away. Within hours, that phrase trended on every platform. #gentleness never goes out of style. Memes, reaction videos, and fan art poured in. People admired how John Wick had responded to confrontation with composure rather than anger. They lauded him as a living testament to grace under fire. Meanwhile, Melissa Carter's team scrambled to do damage control. She recorded a quick video message, disclaiming that her questions were only to provoke deeper dialogue. Some fans defended her, insisting she was simply challenging him. But the broader public narrative had been set. She had tried to corner a beloved star and ended up looking confrontational and dismissive. Sponsors began pulling out from her show, citing negative public perception. Producers faced a flurry of phone calls from the network demanding an explanation. Ratings dipped. Within a few weeks, rumors leaked that the Melissa Carter show was on the chopping block. In a final desperate attempt, Melissa posted a personal video, claiming, "My words were taken out of context. I respect John Wick. We should be able to debate freely without worshiping old Hollywood myths." But it only fueled more backlash from viewers who saw it as petty deflection. All the while, John Wick maintained his characteristic silence. He went about his daily life, filming a new project, greeting fans on the street, and politely declining to comment further on the Carter incident. The less he said, the more people championed him as an icon of quiet dignity. Soon, mainstream news outlets ran headlines like, "When Politeness Wins, How John Wick Flattened a Talk Show Ambush," and the one-line comeback that broke the internet. Media analysts described how the interview highlighted a cultural exhaustion with forced controversies. "People want authenticity," wrote one columnist. And in John Wick, they found it, through calm, unwavering confidence. In less than a month, Melissa Carter's show was quietly restructured. She no longer had her primetime slot. She vanished from the daily talk circuit, replaced by a rotating roster of co-hosts. Insider rumors suggested the network lost faith in her after she so badly mishandled the John Wick segment. As for John Wick, he continued producing the type of films he believed in, stories about loyalty, courage, and redemption. He never gloated about the meltdown, nor did he publicly condemn Melissa. If anything, he remained as reserved as ever. But occasionally, paparazzi would catch him strolling downtown, someone inevitably shouting, "John, you rocked that interview." He'd just smile, wave politely, and carry on. Because, as he said, gentleness never goes out of style. In the end, the fiasco proved a single truth. Genuine humility and respect can shatter even the most carefully orchestrated ambush. Melissa Carter had hoped to dethrone a legend, but all she did was reveal the timeless appeal of sincerity. John Wick walked away unscathed, his reputation even more solidified, while Melissa faded under the weight of her own ill-conceived plan. And so, in a world often consumed by outrage and drama, John Wick's unspoken lesson echoed far and wide. The strongest statement isn't made through fury or aggression, but through an unyielding calm that no one can break.